Hello, and welcome to the Pediatric Nursing Journal podcast series. This series provides extended content relating to articles published in the journal, such as author interviews and roundtable discussions. Before we get started, we have a special offer for our listeners. You can save 50% off 1- and 2-year subscriptions to Pediatric Nursing. Simply visit pediatricnursing.net, click subscribe, and enter PEDSAVE50 to take advantage of this special discount. In this episode, Pediatric Nursing Journal editorial board member Dr. Tedra Smith talks with Dr. Sarah Kelly, an associate professor at Montclair State University School of Nursing, about school violence and bullying. Dr. Kelly unpacks the latest statistics on youth violence in schools and how targeted interventions can be developed by using the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which is published every 2 years by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. This episode provides expanded content from the article The Effects of Exposure to Violence at School on Youth, an analysis of the 2019 Youth Risk Behavior Survey, authored by Dr. Kelly and co-authors Ganga Mahat and Houda Sabeh, and published in the September-October 2023 issue of Pediatric Nursing. We are pleased to present Dr. Smith's interview with Dr. Kelly.
Hello, and welcome to Pediatric Nursing Journal podcast. I'm Tedra Smith, a member of the editorial board of Pediatric Nursing. We are focusing our talks today on violence in school settings, and it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Sarah Kelly. She's an associate professor at Montclair State University School of Nursing in Montclair, New Jersey. She has been a faculty member since 2008 in undergraduate and graduate nursing. Dr. Kelly is a graduate of York College of Pennsylvania. She's also a graduate of the University of North Carolina in Greensboro with her master's and obtained her PhD from the University of Kentucky. Welcome, Dr. Kelly.
Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome to this episode of Pediatric Nursing podcast series.
Thank you for the invitation to speak about this important topic.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being our guest today. Can you tell us about your professional nursing journey and how you became interested in school violence?
Sure, I'd love to. As you mentioned, I graduated from York College of Pennsylvania, and after I did, I moved to North Carolina, and I was working at Duke. I worked in a couple of different areas at Duke University, and one of the areas I ended up working for the longest period of time was a surgical trauma step-down unit. And during that experience, I encountered various different populations of people and their healthcare needs. And one of the predominant groups that we dealt with on that unit specifically were gang members. So I had a firsthand opportunity to take care of gang members and learn about their culture and their experiences. And when I decided to go and obtain my PhD, I needed a foci. And so what I knew clinical-wise was about gang violence and gang members. So I decided to explore that a little bit more, focusing on how exposure to gang violence influences adolescent development and their socialization and their mental health. So from that area, focusing on adolescents exposed to gang violence, it kind of branched out to looking at community violence as a whole, and a subset of community violence was the school violence piece and bullying.
Very interesting. So in your time of working in the surgical trauma area, you saw a lot of gang members, and I'm assuming they were adolescents, and kind of broaden that out into the community, and then more specifically honing in on the school health. So I know you have done some research recently with kind of youth behaviors, specifically as it relates to violence, bullying within the school system, using the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which was established by the CDC and provides information on health-related behaviors and experiences. Can you elaborate a little bit on the purpose of that particular survey and how the results of that survey can be used in healthcare?
Sure. So as you mentioned, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey was developed by the CDC. It's a survey that is completed every 2 years, and they look at a national representation sample of high school students. not only does the CDC use the national representation of high school students, but you can take the CDC, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, and you can also conduct it locally and on the state level. So what I've used is the national representative sample to look across all 50 states in the District of Columbia. The survey focuses on 6 areas of what we call risky behaviors, which include unintended violence or unintended injuries, which is caused by violence, sexual activity, drug use and alcohol use, tobacco use, different dietary habits, and their physical activity. And as you rightly pointed out, I tease out the information related to the school violence or the violent piece, and then the alcohol and drug use, as well as there's some mental health questions that they ask as well that I tease out to use for my research. As I mentioned, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey is nationally representative sample. The CDC publishes this data. Anyone can have access to it if they go to the CDC website. It's publicly available data. A lot of people use it to look at trends over the period of a year because it is conducted every 2 years. So they look to see the trends and see how adolescents are faring or what areas they need to focus on. So public health officials and healthcare providers can see the trajectory over a period of time, and they can use that data to not only inform the public, but also to look at the prevalent issues facing adolescents and youth today, get a better understanding of those issues, and also figure out which areas to prioritize, and then hopefully maybe identify or develop any type of interventions that will need to be looked at into mitigating the effects of those exposures and those behaviors have on their development.
Wow, thank you. Thank you. So if I understand correctly, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey is something that is published by the CDC every 2 years for healthcare officials, public health to be able to use to develop interventions for their particular area. Is that correct?
Yeah, so they can use the data set. Like I mentioned, it's published on the CDC website, cdc.gov, and anyone who has access to that data set, which everybody in the US does, and people in other countries have access to it as well, they can use that to not only look at the trends of what those 6 areas are geared towards for adolescents, but also to help identify and possibly come up with some different strategies on how to deal with those issues and to mitigate the effects that those issues might have on adolescents' development.
Okay. And thinking more about the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, is that information like collected at the school level? Do you know how they go about collecting that information to be used from 50 states?
So nationally, like I said, they take a sample of the 50 states and the District of Columbia, and they randomly select schools to be involved in this, and they distribute it during the school periods. And they typically have a large sample size. The most recent article I used, I think my sample size was a little over 9,000 students.
Very interesting that they publish this much for free. I'm assuming there's a process to get access to it, but it's something that they are collecting every 2 years to be able to kind of tailor interventions for specific areas related to these 6 areas. And I don't want to give too much away, but I would like for you to give us a little bit of information about the results that you found that's coming up in your published article on this topic. If you could talk to us a little bit about some of the key data points that you discovered in your use of the Youth Risk Behavior Survey.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So as you mentioned, I have an article that's being published in the next month or so through Pediatric Nursing, looking at the effects of exposure to violence at school on youth's mental health and their engagement in risk-taking behaviors. So just a few key points about it is that, generally speaking, school violence nationally has decreased, but there are 2 areas that violence at school has either been consistent or has elevated since 2018. Those 2 areas are bullying and the actual school shootings. Just last week, I read a report in CNN that a school district in California is having to financially compensate a family whose son was fatally beaten by 2 bullies at their school. And the family is now receiving a very large settlement because the school did not engage and did not try to do anything, from reading the article on CNN. So my article focuses on describing the effects of exposure to violence at school and how it impacts their health, their mental health, and their engagement in risk-taking behaviors. So we did what we called a secondary analysis of the data that was provided by the CDC, looking at safety concerns that adolescents might have on the way to school, whether they were threatened at school, whether they were engaged in any type of physical fighting at school, when
Mhm.
they were exposed to bullying at school or electronic bullying, looking at their mental health and their use of drugs or alcohol. And what we found were a couple interesting points. One, youth who were bullied at school and online were depressed when compared to non-bullied youth. Being bullied increased the likelihood of being depressed,
Mm.
meaning feeling sad or hopeless.
Right.
Younger youth, meaning those in the 9th or 10th grade, were more inclined to feel sad, whereas older youth, meaning youth in the 11th or 12th grade, were more inclined to attempt suicide. And that youth who were bullied more in general were more likely to attempt suicide. And then there were some gender differences based on females and males, and that females reported more bullying and safety concerns than males did.
So, how could someone take this knowledge that you've been able to extract from the data analysis and develop interventions targeting these specific areas? Because it sounds like the younger kids that were being bullied dealt a lot with depression, and it sounds like the older ones did too, but they actually had more suicide ideation. Is that correct?
That's what we found, that the kids or youth that were in the 9th or 10th grade were more inclined to be depressed, whereas those who were in the 11th or 12th grade not only were depressed, but were also more inclined to act on those depression feelings by attempting suicide.
Okay.
So things that we can do as healthcare practitioners, or even as just people, are to make sure that the kids have resources that they need at schools.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically mental health resources. School nurses do a great job, but there's one school nurse per, a conglomerate of schools in a district.
Mm-hmm.
So having more availability to school nurses, having mental health counselors is one way to start. To have families, parents, and teachers be engaged and to be able to identify those who are most at risk.
Mm-hmm.
Understanding who's at risk and understanding what we can do to help those is key, but we need to know who those people are. So having parents and teachers and guidance counselors be educated on signs to look for those kids that need help.
You bring up a very important point about having access available in the school setting, specifically around mental health, because that's such a growing concern right now, not having access to mental health providers, even outside of the school setting. So being able to provide them with that access where they are at that moment is one of the key things, I think, to ensuring that we address the mental health needs of our younger population in a setting where they feel safe enough to receive that type of care is very important.
I agree. When I started doing my research, I interviewed some kids that were living in inner city violent areas, and I'll never forget the story. I had a kid who was 16 or 17 years old tell me that when he left his house, he wouldn't be surprised if he got shot.
Wow.
That's not normal. Kids should grow up in safe and secure environments. And the fact that this person felt that way, it's troubling. And I'll never forget that kid telling me that when I was, doing my dissertation research. It was very humbling and very eye-opening that people have different life experiences and are exposed to things, and their mental health is really important, and it oftentimes is neglected.
Yes, that's very, very sad to hear those types of stories, and we hear them all too often. And we're seeing an increase in violence that is occurring at school, which used to be thought of as a very safe place, a place where you could go get education, get nutritious meals, and be safe for those 8 or 10 hours that you were there. And that's not the case anymore. That's very unfortunate. And I think the data analysis that you were able to do with the Youth Risk Behavior Survey data continues to highlight that there's really a gap there that we need to address sooner rather than later to ensure not only the mental health stability of children as they get older and transition to adulthood, but just the safety in the school settings. So very, very, very important topic there.
Yeah, I mean, you're 100% correct. People learn from their environment. If that's what they're surrounded by on a daily basis, they take that with them, and that's what they live with, and they learn from that, and then they pass those behaviors on to other people.
Yes, very true. They pass those behaviors on to the next generation. So it's important that we develop interventions and resources to target that where we can, and honestly gather support for school nurses, because in some settings the school nurses are so busy just giving medications that there's no time to do anything else.
And it's very true. They're taking care of all of the kids in that school, that have medical needs.
Mm-hmm.
And then on top of it, they're having to deal with all these other things that are coming up that, you can't account for. You can't plan for this stuff to happen because it just happens sometimes. And
Mm-hmm.
so they're stretched thin. So having more available resources at the school is huge, whether
Mm-hmm.
that be another school nurse or another guidance counselor, someone who's trained with mental health in the mental health area is huge. Also, having people promote positive behaviors, positive responses, maybe engaging in some cognitive behavioral therapies to mitigate the effects that these exposures might have on kids is important. And let the students know that they're not alone. People oftentimes think that they're alone in the situation, but they're not. Other kids have similar experiences and they just don't want to share because they think that it would make them look less than others. But that's not true. Kids often experience similar situations. They just don't share them with people. But if you let them know they're not by themselves and they're not alone in this, more people might be willing to be supportive of them and to engage with them.
Mm-hmm. That's very true. That's very true. And it's important to know that we have this information available and it is updated every 2 years through the CDC to help target specific interventions. And so as we've come to the end of our discussion, because I don't want to give too much away about the article, because I would like for people to be able to read a little bit more in pediatric nursing, but where can our listeners find out more about the Youth Risk Behavior Survey and how to access it and how to further use it to combat youth violence?
Yes, absolutely. So as I mentioned earlier, you can find the Youth Risk Behavior Survey at the cdc.gov/healthy youth. And on that website, it presents the methodology on how they collected the data, the questionnaire that they use, and it gives you different data sets, whether you have SPSS or whether you use SAS or some other data management program that gives you the data sets there that you can use. And as you mentioned, it is published every 2 years. So you can go back as far as the late 1990s and see trends over years, time periods. I've been fortunate enough that I've worked with the Youth Risk Behavior Survey since 2011. I've used it for student projects that were students that were engaging in research, as well as my own research. So it's very user friendly. The one limitation is that it is data that's already collected. So you have to mold your research or tailor your research to what is offered via the Youth Risk Behavior Survey data set.
Mm-hmm. And there's anything you need to do to be able to access that data, any specific criteria that you need to meet to be able to access that data?
It's our tax dollars pay for it. So it's publicly available data. The only thing that they do ask is if you publish off of it, you obviously cite the CDC.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Kelly, for being with us today, taking the time to talk with me about the use of the Youth Risk Behavior Survey and how we're able to take that data and do some very targeted, specific interventions based off that information, based off the region where you be located. So I appreciate sharing expertise. For those of you listening today, if you would like to know more about Dr. Kelly's analysis of the Youth Behavior Survey and more information on this topic, it will be published in the next issue of Pediatric Nursing. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me. Appreciate the time.
Thank you.
The Pediatric Nursing Journal podcast series is owned and produced by Genetti Publications, Incorporated. All rights reserved. No portion of this podcast may be used without written permission. Dr. Sarah Kelly is an associate professor at Montclair State University School of Nursing in Montclair, New Jersey. Dr. Tedra Smith is an associate professor, the assistant dean for graduate clinical education, MSN, and the director of pediatric partnerships at the University of Alabama at Birmingham School of Nursing, Birmingham, Alabama. In addition, Dr. Smith is a member of the Pediatric Nursing Editorial Board. For archived episodes of this podcast and to learn more about pediatric nursing, visit the journal's website at pediatricnursing.net. You can also subscribe to the Pediatric Nursing Journal podcast series everywhere you get your podcasts. And remember, As a listener, you can save 50% off a 1- or 2-year subscription to Pediatric Nursing. Simply visit pediatricnursing.net, click subscribe, and enter PED SAVE 50 to take advantage of this special discount.